Hello, and welcome to the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your social media feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
And I'm Vivi Gunning, also known as Sugi, the author of the novel Brotherless.
Did you participate in all the excitement over the big new Pope choosing event?
The word you're looking for is
I thought that was a Netflix show.
My friend. Conclave was a movie directed by starring Ray Fiennes, and it was, in fact, about choosing a pope. A conclave is the meeting where the cardinals in the Catholic Church choose the new pope. How am I explaining it to you?
It's just more new pope choosing excitement, media, whatever, tweets.
You're like not very excited?
I'm not Catholic. I'm not particularly religious, so why would I care about this guy in Rome, getting elected to wear robes and tell people stuff?
Well, he's from Chicago. He's the first American pope. And plus, you're a writer who grew up in the 80s. And so what if I told you that the music young Whitney listened to, the books you read and the movies you saw during that whole period were all influenced by a powerful intersection of pop culture, politics, and religion? That's what our guest today, Paul Elie, argues in his new book, The Last Supper, Art, Faith, Sex, and Controversy in the 1980s. Paul's also going to talk to us about the new pope. He's the author of The Life You Save May Be Your Own, published in 2003, as well as Reinventing Bach, published in 2012, both of them National Book Critics Circle Award finalists. He's a senior fellow in Georgetown University's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, as well as a regular contributor to The New Yorker. He lives in Brooklyn. Paul, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. So glad to be with you both.
So your book's not about Pope Leo, I guess that number's 14, is that right? XIV, as I keep reading it. But you recently wrote a retrospective on Pope Francis for The New Yorker, and I think your book, I mean, you can't be upset that they changed the Pope right now. I mean, your book is extremely helpful in framing a cultural and historical context for this new Pope. So to do that, I wonder if you could start by reading to us about another famous Pope, John Paul II, whose papacy began in 1978 and who is featured prominently in your book.
Sure thing. So he was elected after his predecessor, John Paul I, died after only a month in office. So there were two conclaves in 1978 with the whole hullabaloo done twice over. And the result of the second conclave was that the first non-Italian pope in several hundred years was elected, Karol Wojtyła, Archbishop of Krakow, who took the name John Paul II. And the early days of John Paul II's pontificate were not dissimilar from what we're seeing with Pope Leo. Enthusiasm, hope, speculation, a kind of Kremlinology, reading every detail about his life for allegorical significance. And that's where I'll pick up this brief passage from early in my book, The Last Supper. John Paul II was feted in New York City and profiled by the newsweeklies as a forward-looking, convention-defying figure. In his travels, 4 trips to 7 countries in the year after his election, trips to 6 African countries and to Brazil in the first part of 1980, his doctrinal traditionalism was offset by his gifts as a communicator. Here was a man who had grasped how to express the Catholic point of view through strong images of himself, the Holy Father, reproduced in the mass media. But the man whose hand Andy Warhol had clasped in St. Peter's Square that April was instituting a heavy-handed traditionalism in church affairs. He revoked the teaching license of the Swiss theologian Hans Küng, a participant in Vatican II who saw centralized papal authority as contrary to the spirit of the council. He had the Vatican open an investigation of liberation theology and sent a bishop to El Salvador to check on Oscar Romero, Archbishop of San Salvador, whose homilies, broadcast by radio across the country, urged Salvadorans to resist the ruling military junta, which had long presumed the support of the church. On March 24, 1980, Romero was assassinated by government snipers as he said Mass at a hospital chapel. The Vatican had been working to remove him from office by other means. John Paul was particularly traditional on matters of human sexuality. At the weekly general audiences in St. Peter's Square, he set out a theology of the body. It was philosophically lofty, but was rooted in a simple dichotomy about the nature of sex. On the one hand, there is sex between unmarried persons, driven by lust, and using sex for sheer physical gratification. On the other, there is the mutual gift of sexual consummation within Christian marriage, open to the birth of a child and the prospect of parenthood, where alone the sexual act is properly extraordinary. At a general audience in 1981, a gunman shot John Paul as he moved through the crowd. The Pope survived and eventually visited the attacker in prison, offering forgiveness. John Paul gained in stature and aura through the episode. By surviving, he somehow transcended mortality, becoming an image as much as a man with a body.
Thank you so much. So you mentioned Vatican II in that passage. So for the Catholic illiterate among us, like Whitney,
I'm raising my hand.
what was Vatican II, and what was Pope John Paul's relationship to that document?
So the Vatican II was a council that took place across 4 years that produced a series of documents rearticulating the sense of the church and its role in the world in light of modernity. My grand uncle, Bishop Robert F. Joyce of Burlington, took part in the Second Vatican Council. And so it was a big part of my family's life. And I imagine it was a big part of the early life of the new Pope, too, because it was all over the news weeklies and the newspapers from 62 to 65. So the question following the council was just how much it had made an accommodation with modernity. And different theologians and cardinals took different positions on this. And John Paul, who, as Wojtyła from Krakow, had been a participant in the council, not so long afterward began to feel that the council had gone too far and was being misinterpreted, that the spirit of the council was being invoked in ways that trumped the letter of the very carefully worded council documents. And so he joined a party that began to push back strongly against a progressive interpretation of the council and to argue rather for one that it called the authoritative interpretation of the council. And then when he became pope, he used the bully pulpit, that is the papacy, to really enshrine that strong clampdown on an excessive extension of the council throughout the church.
In what ways was Vatican II thought to be more progressive than the previous ways the church had taught? And this helps us set up for this later discussion, because I think it's helpful to have these sort of signposts, as we talk about moving through this period in the 80s. Because Pope John Paul, as you say, pushed back against this quite a bit and was much more conservative, if I'm using the right terms.
Sure thing. I mean, it pervades the story that I tell in my book, the attempts to work out the Second Vatican Council in people's everyday lives. The church used to require people to ask permission to read certain books like Madame Bovary. That practice was suspended. The Catholics weren't to go into other houses of worship.
Wait, I want to go back to Madame Bovary. I think that seems like a good idea.
Yeah.
So what was the church doing? Was trying to make sure people understood that it was a bad idea to have affairs, or what was the purpose of reading Madame Bovary?
I'm not really sure. I know it's because Flannery O'Connor wrote to a priest she knew asking for permission to read Madame Bovary when it was on the index. I don't know what their grievance with it was, but there were dozens of works, movies, books, etc., that you weren't supposed to look at if you were a Catholic. That ended with the Second Vatican Council. In sex too, the old rules still applied and were reiterated endlessly, but in the West, especially, a certain amount of trust was placed on the individual Catholic to search things out according to his or her own conscience. So whether it was culture, sexuality, or the fact that Catholics were now mingling in the wider world rather than staying in tightly knit neighborhoods, often defined by ethnic loyalty, all these things meant that there was an openness in Catholic culture that there hadn't been for a couple of 100 years. And the effects of that were felt in the 60s and the 70s and were still being felt in the 80s.
So just to connect us back to the beginning of this, and then we're going to move on strictly to talk about the book, where does Pope Leo, our new Pope, and the Catholic Church in general now, all these years after Vatican II and then John Paul's more conservative rule, stand on that continuum?
It's hard to know for sure. He's just getting started, and he, unlike a lot of people in his position, hasn't left a vast paper trail of documents stating his positions and everything. In his early speeches, he strongly affirmed the Second Vatican Council in a positive way. And in particular, he's affirmed an aspect of it that has been given fresh emphasis by Pope Francis, which is called synodality. It's a technical term which, in the broad sense, has meant that a greater number of people should have a role in the life of the church when it comes to decision making, and that it shouldn't just be the Pope and the cardinals. And that was an imperative of Vatican II that's been carried out fitfully, let's say, over the past half century. So he's for synodality, he's for Vatican II, and he has strongly affirmed a wish to carry forward the openness of the church under Pope Francis.
So, in the prologue to your book, you reference Sinead O'Connor's famous 1992 Saturday Night Live appearance. She tore up a photo of Pope John Paul II. And you say that between 79 and that moment in 1992, I'm quoting here, figures in what we call popular culture engaged in questions of faith and art and the ways they fit together with an intensity rarely seen before or since. So, what caused that to happen? And when did you first kind of identify that as a pattern that you wanted to write about?
So I grew up in that period. I was born in 1965. I moved to New York City to go to Jesuit University Fordham in '83. And so a lot of the material in the book I encountered firsthand, even though it's not written in the first person. But when did I start thinking about it as material? It was after the publication of my first book, The Life You Save May Be Your Own, in 2003. That book's about four American Catholic writers from the middle of the century: Dorothy Day, Walker Percy, Flannery O'Connor, and Thomas Merton. And as I did events in connection with that book, there were two questions. One is, what kind of Catholic was I? And the other was, where are the successors to those great American Catholic writers? And I became to feel that it was a category mistake, really. People were looking, and maybe I was looking for direct successors or inheritors of that really robust mid-century Catholic literary culture. And instead, I gradually came to think that in the period following, a different kind of energy was being felt. You had people raised religious, kind of emancipated from former religion by the 60s, by fame, by success, but who retained a passion for religion and a keen sense of identifying themselves as religious, which they worked out on the margins where religion met popular culture in the period that I treat in the book, roughly from 79 to 92.
Okay, so I grew up during the same time, Paul. It was so there's so many cultural references in this book that I really enjoy. So that has been a lot of fun. I remember, by the way, my parents who were Christian, an evangelical Christian, bringing the Dylan album, that the first like Christian Dylan album to me, as like, see, you could listen to this instead of Van Halen. I was like, no, thank you. I will not do that. But anyway, you also use a term called crypto-religious, which I'm going to now steal and use for the rest of my life, to describe how artists from Andy Warhol to Bob Dylan are engaging religious thought and religious iconography during this time. I wonder if you could define that term for us, and talk about how it applies to somebody like Warhol.
Sure thing. The term comes from the Lithuanian poet Czesław Miłosz, who used it in an exchange of letters with Thomas Merton, the monk, in the late 50s. So when I began to think of applying it to this period, I had to really figure out, in a narrative sense, what do I mean when I say crypto-religious? And for me as a writer, to define one's terms is a profound act. There's a big figuring out that involves there. So crypto-religious art, as I put it in the book, is work that incorporates religious words and images and motifs that expresses something other than conventional belief. It's work that raises the question of what the person who made it believes. So the question of what it means to believe is crucial to the work's effect. As you see it, the work, hear it, read it, listen to it, then you wind up reflecting on your own beliefs.
I also wanted to ask you about a term that seems related to this, is this Vatican II concept of that the ordinary is the site of the extraordinary, and that sort of way, a different way of thinking about uh, religion, basically, or Catholicism, a broadening out of finding the extraordinary. Is that connected to, is that, I mean, how does that move into Warhol's work specifically?
So Andy Warhol, who was raised a Byzantine Catholic in Pittsburgh, and then moved to New York after going to the Carnegie Institute of Art, his conviction, established relatively early in his career, coming from advertising, was that the imagery of post-war America was full of presence, and he used that term, which is a Catholic term in the sense that Catholics describe the Eucharist as the real presence of the Eucharist, that Christ is really present in the Mass. So Warhol saw presence everywhere. He didn't think that you needed to kind of add meaning to a Coke bottle or have an inscrutable work like that of the abstract expressionists. The images themselves were so full of presence in his view that the ordinary just was extraordinary. And in a complicated way, but one that I hope emerges clearly in the story that I tell, that became an aesthetic for a whole generation of post-Vatican II crypto-religious folks.
So fascinating. I should say that, I mean, I'm not, I was raised Hindu and would identify myself, I guess, as a Hindu atheist, which I'm told I'm allowed to do. And my family is Sri Lankan Tamil from northern Sri Lanka, where there were Christian Catholic missionaries. And there's this like really interesting sort of affinity that I've always seen sort of between Hinduism and Catholicism. And I also, just over the course of my life, have been friends with a lot of lapsed Catholics. And I'm sort of curious about the relationship between sort of the crypto religion as you're defining it and just kind of like being a lapsed Catholic, which is, I mean, sometimes how folks are identifying themselves, like in when they'll say, you know, like in the way almost that I just identified myself as a Hindu, but they identify culturally very strongly as Catholic. Their spirituality is not like kind of in the same place. And then that like that notion of presence, that also is like actually kind of Hindu in an interesting way. And so like there's a lot of like porosity between these communities, like where my parents come from. So I'm just curious about kind of how those ideas might connect at all.
How the sense of the ordinary is extraordinary fits in with Hinduism, that's probably another conversation. I want to look into that. But I wrote this book partly out of a dissatisfaction with a category like lapsed Catholic. So a lot of people use it, but it owes its origin to the time half a century ago where people had so much religion stuffed into them by the time they were 12 and were confirmed that then they could spend the rest of their lives kind of lapsing or falling away from it. But by the time that, and that was true for a lot of the, especially the older artists in the book, Martin Scorsese, very thick Catholic childhood, for example. But many of the figures in the book belong to this slightly later period in the 80s where you kind of picked up some religion as you went along. And so the idea that you once had it all and then kind of fell away from it is less applicable to my own generation, let's say, than it was to the baby boom generation and the wartime generation. And that's why I'm trying to use this term crypto religious instead. And I think that religious instincts, they do die, but they die hard. And so many of the people drawn to the work that I described, the songs of U2 and the Smiths or the novels of Toni Morrison, are drawn to it partly because of that sense of a real, but you use the word porous, border crossing religiosity.
Yeah, I appreciate this definition. Lapsed Catholic friends who listen to this podcast, you want to pick up Paul's book. And sort of interestingly, I often find that like when I like a band and then I look up who they are, I'm like, oh, they're Christian. And this brings me to U2. Unbelievably, we've never talked about U2 on this podcast before, so I'm not going to miss the chance now. And you point to them as a source of crypto religious devotion and say that Bono marked the spot where many of us still find ourselves. Religion has let us down, but religious yearning is still there, stronger than we might expect. And I noticed that you shift into first person plural there. Is this something that you felt during that era or maybe feel now?
Absolutely. So I grew up in upstate New York in Albany, which had a really vibrant music scene because it's the town that bands stopped in the day before they went to New York or the day after they went to New York. So everybody passed through, including U2, who played their third American gig in Albany on the Boy tour, then played a second time at a local nightclub on the October tour. And on the video for Gloria, the Edge is wearing a T-shirt from our local nightclub, JB Scott's. So when we saw this video endlessly, it was like something to take such pride in that Albany was represented in one of the great rock videos of the period. Then they played SUNY Albany, a spring weekend show, and their fame had really exploded between when they booked the gig and when they played the gig. I was in high school, but I went, stood in the front, $8, $3 plastic cups of beer. And there was Bono 20 feet away climbing the lighting rig with that giant flagpole with a white flag on it. The flag that to me is one of the emblems of crypto religiosity. He's expressing a devotion, but to what he's devoted is indeterminate and for people to figure out. And that's what bugged a lot of people about U2 in the punk scene that I associated with. he was just so exposed and so full of yearning with no negativity. And he wasn't calling for an end to this or that war, or supporting the Sandinistas like the Clash. It was much more general, and that made him very vulnerable. But to me, that made him and U2, very attractive. And yes, he did. I did feel that he spoke for me.
That idea of I like the passages on YouTube. I wonder if you could just talk more about the reason that you call their music like a kind of devotion, right? Rather than a criticism or a conflict, like in the specifics, and particularly the song Gloria, is a song that you spent some time breaking down. I wonder if you could do that for our listeners and talk about the way that devotion plays a role in the U2's music.
Absolutely. And to go a little bit lofty, one of the things I've tried to do with this book is to introduce terms that we as people of our generation, I'm almost 60 years old and younger, can use to identify our own kind of religious disposition. So instead of just, are you Catholic, or are you lapsed, or are you agnostic, or are you atheist, one of those qualities is to be a devotee. Some of us are just prone to devotion. We want to point ourselves toward, or even consecrate ourselves toward, some ideal that's outside of the self, to transcend ourselves through something other or outer. And often the desire to do so precedes the object of the devotion. So we're just kind of inclined to devotion, and then we have to find an object of our devotion. So U2, the story of their early career is an almost pure devotion to something larger than the self, that then got progressively more or better defined to left-wing causes, to reform in Central and South America, eventually to Jubilee and debt relief and so forth. That's the story, one of the stories about U2's career. But then many of us as fans, what we were devoted to was different bands. And so punk, which was characterized in the press as such a negative experience, for those of us in the trenches, so to speak, it was a devotional experience. We waited ardently for the band to come to town and for us to kind of surround them and direct our passion in their direction. For me, it was Talking Heads and The Clash and U2 and REM, all of whom passed through Albany, multiple times in those years, and got my devotion in full.
When I played in a band, we played all those all those songs, and the feeling that I never thought about this until reading the book, because I was like, my parents were very religious. I was rebelling against that. But I did feel when I played U2 songs, that kind of energy, that yearning, that the excitement of the songs was specific and unique, I thought, to that band. However, we are a podcast about literature and politics, so we got to move on to the books. We got to talk about the writers of this period. You mentioned, just to name a few, Louise Erdrich, William Kennedy, Toni Morrison, Seamus Heaney as writers whose work was intersecting with religious themes in interesting ways during the 80s. Could you talk about the similarities you find in their work?
It's pretty striking the way you've juxtaposed it with devotion. I'm learning something about my own book in this conversation. So while the musicians, or U2 anyway, were focused on devotion, the experience from the fund of religious archetypes that seems to unite the novelists and writers you mentioned is an experience of limbo or purgatory. So Saint Marie, it's an early story by Louise Erdrich from Love Medicine. And it's about a girl who tries to escape some of the rough patches of native upbringing by consecrating herself to this sort of witchy nun. But she goes through a kind of trial by literal fire in the course of the story. The great, to me, crypto-Catholic novel Ironweed by William Kennedy is about a man who is suspended in limbo as he tries to find his way back to his family after some unspeakable acts that led for one of his sons to die in infancy. Then, in an uncanny way, Toni Morrison, who was sharing an office with William Kennedy at SUNY Albany in those years, began Beloved in a similar way, with a dead child who kind of reproaches the living from beyond the grave and is suspended in a kind of limbo. But the novel is partly about the child's act of witness and what it compels the living adults in the novel to do to try to make things right. And then Seamus Heaney, his cycle of that period, the best known of them was called Station Island. He goes to this island off the coast of Ireland that is set up like a kind of Stations of the Cross, and he works his way through them in a literary way. So all these novelists are fascinated with this term that, in strictly speaking, had passed out of religious practice in those years of purgatory or limbo. It was still present for them imaginatively, and they went really deep with it.
So yeah, we're talking about devotion, and I'm realizing how rarely I talk about devotion and how often I talk about guilt. Um, huh. Anyway, crypto religious.
There's plenty of guilt in the book too.
Yeah, that's true. I think this is like one of my affinities for Catholicism. But that's a whole nother episode. So anyway, crypto religious devotion or fiction, of course, isn't the only thing going on in the 80s. There's also, of course, a ton of protest going on, and organized religion gave artists and activists a lot to protest about. We mentioned Sinead O'Connor earlier, but this is earlier, and here we're talking about like the gay community and AIDS. And can you talk a little bit about how gay men became scapegoats for Christian leaders in the 80s?
So, The Scapegoat is the title of a book by René Girard, the French cultural theorist who wound up teaching at Stanford. And it came out, I didn't realize this until I was in the middle of my research, in 87, in the very period that the book's describing actual scapegoating. So, as Girard has it, the scapegoat is a kind of archetypal act whereby a community is divided, disunified, and they find their way back to unity by identifying a scapegoat, a person who's the cause of trouble in the community, and unifying in the act of driving that person out of the community. And the act of driving them out of the community brings the community together in what seems like a unity, but it never lasts. So you always have to find a new scapegoat. And in some respects, that's the story of what was going on with religion and gay people in the 80s. Evangelicals were divided by the fact that they'd emerged into public life through Carter and Reagan. The right wing evangelicals sought to kind of unify the community, and the scapegoat was gay people. When AIDS came along, Jerry Falwell and the moral majority blamed gay people and said they had it coming to them, that it was God's own revenge or the witness of truth on gay people, that they were suffering in this way. Horrible to witness in New York City, as I did in that period. To a certain extent, the Catholic clerics signed on, although with qualifications. And so in this moment when not only were gay men suffering at scale in New York and San Francisco especially, but to bring it back, Sugi, to what you mentioned about devotion, where gay men were brought into acts of devotion to one another because they had to care for one another. You had the external culture deciding that gays were the enemy and deriving a kind of cultural unity from their shared antipathy to gay people and everything they represented.
The interesting thing about that Scapegoat book, which I have not read, but I have now read about in your book, was that the author was originally saying that Christ was a kind of scapegoating figure for bringing together. Like there's a way of thinking about Christianity as a religion that's formed around that concept. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, and Girard's view, which is controversial, is that Christ was the ultimate scapegoat, and that the effort to scapegoat Christ wound up with Christ being recognized as Lord, and that this gave the lie or showed the falsity of the scapegoating process once and for all. That we can now see through scapegoating and see it what it is, as just a false attempt at unity. And this is the controversial part, because of the kind of once and for all transcending of the scapegoating act that is represented by the resurrection of Christ.
You know,
It's
that sure
complicated.
that didn't work very well. I mean, it hasn't borne out.
Plenty of scapegoating, yes, but this was his view, and there's it's got a certain interpretive power to it.
I want to circle back to this discussion of religion, politics, and pop culture back around to today. You mentioned that Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale was published in 1985. Um, but it was a cultural touchstone for this. It has been a cultural touchstone for this age now through the very popular Netflix series that ran from 2017 until April of 2025. Now, to what extent does this age that we're in resemble or extend this crossover between popular culture and the crypto religious fascination of the 1980s?
I think the fascination is still there, and the attention paid to the conclave is another example. Just a few years ago, we were quite accurately reflecting on the cardinals as like uh, accomplices in criminal acts of cover up over clerical sexual abuse. And now all the eyes of the world were trained on them, but partly because of the power of the imagery and the ritual and the costumes, which aren't so different from the costumes in The Handmaid's Tale. I think the difference is that after 1992, in ways that Sinead's tearing up of the photo of the Pope both kind of augured and was a consequence of, a hard line was drawn between religion and irreligion. And partly that's owing to the heightening or deepening of the culture wars, and partly that's due to the introduction of violence. When the Ayatollah Khomeini calls for the death of Salman Rushdie for a novel that's considered offensive to Islam, that takes things to a new place, and you have to choose sides in a different way. And many people, including Cardinal O'Connor, the Archbishop of New York, made what I consider the wrong choice, siding against the novelist whose novel he had not read. So a rigidity or a hard line is now present. Of course, the bombing of the World Trade Center twice is a factor. So violence has changed the calculus. So in that sense, the time I write about from 79 to 92 was a time of fluidity and of open boundaries and of a kind of freedom of identification with religion that even Madonna, when she was deeply opposed to the church, was still identifying as a Catholic in a way that I don't think, I don't want to say it's inconceivable now, but it's striking to look back and realize that not only did she still identify as a Catholic, but she actually called out Sinead O'Connor for her act. Madonna criticizing Sinead, saying there are different ways to make a point. That to me was totally surprising, and I'd forgotten it. So when I read it again in the research, it felt like, wow, that's a different period.
You also mentioned, I remember this controversy, Andre Serrano's Piss Christ that Jesse Helms got involved in. And that was a sort of, again, a drawing of the lines there, I think. Would that be fair to say?
Absolutely. And what's forgotten now is that, so Sinead was vilified for tearing up the photograph of the Pope on SNL, but there was a precedent for it. A US senator who, by the way, had given the commencement address at my graduation from Fordham, went to the House floor and tore up the photograph of Piss Christ, essentially to make a point about arts funding. It was a stagey act of agitprop on the Senate floor. So Sinead's act of tearing up didn't come out of nowhere. You had the shenanigans of some grandstanding senators preceding her.
So I'm going to be the person who asks this question for the listeners who may have been born too late to know what Piss Christ is. Could you explain this to our listeners who might not be familiar with that particular work of art?
So Andres Serrano was and still is a not so well-known artist in New York City, and he made a series of works that had to do with bodily fluids, blood, milk, and urine. And one of them involved, let me tell the story from the other direction. An image was produced of a crucifix suffused in a kind of golden glow, so that it's conventionally beautiful and partakes of Renaissance ideas of light and glitter. And then it has this very blunt title, Piss Christ. And so it emerged that the golden glow was his own urine into which the crucifix had been suffused and then photographed on a grand scale. So all this was supported in part by a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts. The photograph was shown at various venues, North Carolina, Los Angeles, I think one other place. And then when the evangelical Christians got wind of this, they started a letter writing campaign to pressure their senators to condemn the work and withdraw the funding and in fact shut down the whole agency. So this work, which had moved unmolested through various museums, was suddenly a phenomenon. And unfortunately, it was a phenomenon that the general public was unable to see because the newspapers took their cue from the politicians and wouldn't reproduce the image. So a whole chapter of my book called Unspeakable is devoted to this weird moment in which art is being condemned out of hand on behalf of the public, which is prevented from seeing it by the government and the mass media kind of colluding to keep it out of view.
And you write
Thank you
about
so much for
Scorsese,
coming.
Scorsese's Last Temptation of Christ, which was being completed around the end of this period. It had similar issues around it. Am I not correct about that?
Yeah, so it's to me really rich that the Christian right was harshly set against homosexuality and set against um, the supposedly blasphemous imagery like that of Piss Christ. And yet, when Scorsese offered an image of a dream sequence in which Christ dreamed of a fairly conventional heterosexual marriage with children, that too was condemned out of hand. He was like, the artist can't win here. There's no acceptable image to the people who are set against the crypto religiosity of my protagonists. And so that movie came out, filled theaters in 7 cities for a week or two with protest outside. But then the VHS release was suppressed, and a decade passed before you could really see the film for yourself, unless you'd seen it on that opening weekend in one of those 7 cities.
It's really interesting to read your book. And I mean, I think I was reading it through the lens kind of thinking about, I'd studied the culture wars in grad school, and then also just thinking about recent attacks on the NEA and just kind of the sanitizing of art, which I've been talking about with my students recently. And just thinking about how even a lot of the art that I love now is the least safe art now is safer than the least safe art when I was young. Um, I don't know. I had kind of that memory of the attacks on that art had kind of fallen away, and then sort of thinking about just even all of the things I've seen where like MAGA folks sort of talking about like the Kennedy Center and what is the Kennedy Center for? Like, what are all of these spaces for culture for, and what kinds of culture are they producing, and are they okay? Like, what kinds of images are we allowing? What kinds of risk?
Only
There's
musicals from the 1950s.
apparently there was like something, maybe an Onion article, which was like Trump is going to cast his whole cabinet in a Kennedy Center musical because that's the only person. Those are the only people who will be allowed to perform at the Kennedy Center, the only people willing to perform at the Kennedy Center. And I was like, I mean, it seems like we're terribly close to that. And so um, I want to ask you if you think that MAGA faith in Trump is a kind of crypto.
So I don't think there's any coherence to MAGA, and that's those of us who try to be coherent for a living, we struggle with the incoherence of it. Does it make any sense that the same man who wants to sanitize the Kennedy Center has released on the official social media account of the White House an image of himself as a pre-modern pope? There's no sense there. There's no rhyme or reason. Is there any sense to J.D. Vance trumpeting a medieval idea of order on the one hand, but allying himself with the disorderly, order-destroying president to beat all? These things don't make any sense. So that's the first thing that's to be said. I think that it's chaotic. If anything, I think MAGA faith, if you can call it that, isn't cryptic at all. It's if anything, too explicit. They're totally open in their wish for their kind of nationalist view to be promoted. Coherence be damned. 3 marriages, no piety at all, no interest in Christianity of any kind until it was instrumental for his election. That's, to me, Donald Trump. But it does show, and this it does have in common with the material in my book, that the images and motifs of religion, part of their power is that they can't be controlled or tamped down, and they can be used for all sorts of different purposes. And to understand the way that happened in the 80s, that art and imagery kind of run out of bounds, is to recognize that they can also run out of bounds in the ways that I've just described. So in that sense, yes, there's a point in common.
Paul, thanks so much for joining us. I really loved reading your book, and we encourage listeners to go out and pick up The Last Supper, Art, Faith, Sex, and Controversy in the 1980s, as well as Paul's other books at your local independent bookstore.
Thank you so much. I've gotten so much out of this.
Thank you so much.
All right, we can turn everything off. That was great.
Thank you. And I hope we didn't get to Gloria, but
that's okay. We did a good job.
Oh, but yeah, that was really great.
I mean, hearing Latin, most of us hadn't heard Latin when it wasn't like we all grew up hearing Latin and then heard you two singing it, or I didn't.
Definitely not me.
That was almost the first experience of Latin, and that's one of the surprises of it, I think.
Okay, hold on.
Sugi, do you know Randy Boyagoda?